Chapter 4. A Voyage to Brobdingnag. Being an active and restless person, only 2 months after my return to England I left again, for I wished to see foreign countries. I sailed away on a ship headed for India. The voyage was good until we passed Madagascar, when some strong winds began to blow, continuing for 20 days. We were carried very far to the east, until the oldest sailor on board could not tell what part of the world we were in. On the 16th of June, 1703, we discovered land. The captain sent 12 men in a boat to the land to look for fresh water to drink, which we needed. I went with them in order to see the country. The men searched on the shore to find some fresh water near the sea, and I walked for a while alone. I soon began to feel tired, and seeing nothing interesting, I slowly returned to where I had left the men. To my surprise, I saw that the men had already got into the boat and were rowing quickly back to the ship. I was going to shout after them to wait for me, when suddenly I noticed a huge creature walking quickly after them in the sea. He was in the water up to his knees and was taking giant steps, but the monster was not able to catch the men. Full of fear, I ran as fast as I could up a hill, from the top of which I had a view of the country. The length of the craft surprised me, for it was about 20 feet high. I found a wide road, or so it seemed to me, passing through a field of corn. The corn was as tall as trees. Suddenly I saw one of the inhabitants crossing from the next field into this one, the same size as the man I had seen in the sea chasing our boat. He appeared as tall as a church steeple, and took about 10 yards in each step. I was terrified and ran to hide in the corn. I saw him turn his head to look behind him and call out in a voice as loud as thunder, after which 7 monsters like him came towards him with scythes in their hands. These people weren't as well dressed as the first, and they seemed to be his workers. He spoke some words to them, and then they went to cut the corn in the field where I was. I stayed as far away from them as I could, but their steps were so huge that it was nearly impossible to stay very far ahead of them as they cut the corn. Soon they were very close behind me. Exhausted, full of grief and despair, I lay down in the dirt and believed that I would end my days there. I sadly thought about my wife in England, who would soon become a widow, and my children fatherless. I regretted my own foolishness in attempting a second voyage against the advice of all my friends and family. I thought of Lilliput, whose inhabitants thought of me as the greatest being in the world, where I was able to capture a whole kingdom's warships in my hand and do lots of other things that would be recorded forever in the history books of that empire. I thought about how humiliating it would be for me to appear as unimportant in this nation as one single Lilliputian would be among us in England. One of the workers came very close to where I lay, and I was sure that with his next step I would be killed under his foot. When he was about to move again, I screamed as loudly as I could. The huge creature stopped, looked around for a moment, and then noticed me as I lay on the ground. He picked me up between his finger and thumb and held me up to his eyes. I tried not to move as he held me in the air about 60 feet from the ground, although he painfully pinched my sides. I placed my hands together and spoke some words in a quiet and gentle tone, for I feared that at any moment he would throw me onto the ground, as we usually do with any little horrible creature. But I was lucky. He seemed to like my voice and gestures and looked at me with curiosity, amazed that I was speaking, although he could not understand me. He put me gently into his coat pocket and immediately ran with me to his master, the man I had first seen in the field. The farmer looked at me carefully. He put me softly on the ground, and I walked slowly back and forth to let the people know I did not want to run away. I took off my hat and bowed to the farmer. He tried to speak to me, but I couldn't understand anything he said. I answered as loudly as I could, in several languages, and he often lay down and put his ear close to me, but without success. We couldn't understand each other. He put me in his pocket and carried me home to his house. He called his wife and showed me to her, but she screamed and jumped back, as women in England do at the sight of a toad or a spider. However, when she had watched my behavior for a while, and seen how polite and friendly I was towards her and her husband, she was no longer afraid and even began to like me. A servant brought in dinner, and the farmer and his family sat around the table. The farmer put me on the table, which was about 30 feet from the floor. I was terrified and stayed as far as I could from the edge to keep from falling off. The farmer's wife cut up a bit of meat for me and crumbled some bread and put it in front of me. When dinner was done, the farmer went out to his fields and left his wife to take care of me. I was very tired, which the woman noticed, and she put me on her bed and covered me with a clean white handkerchief. I slept about 2 hours. When I woke up, I lay for a while resting. Suddenly, 2 rats crept up the curtains and ran backwards and forwards on the bed. One of them came up almost to my face, and I jumped up frightened and pulled out my sword to defend myself. They attacked me on both sides, and one of them grabbed my collar with its front feet, but I stabbed my sword into its belly before it could hurt me. It fell down, and the other one, seeing what had happened to its friend, tried to escape, but I managed to cut it on the back with my sword as it ran away, making its blood flow. These creatures were the size of wild pigs and extremely fierce. If I had not kept my belt and sword on me as I slept, I surely would have been torn to pieces and eaten. I couldn't drag the rat's body off the bed, where it still lay bleeding. It was too disgusting. When the farmer's wife came into the room, she was shocked to see me covered in blood and quickly picked me up and held me in her hands. Then she told the maid to pick the rat up and throw it out the window. Chapter 5. Performing for the Crowds. The farmer had a 9-year-old daughter who began to take care of me. She had a cradle for one of her dolls, and she hung this cradle inside her wardrobe for me to sleep in, to be safe from the rats. Her name was Glumdalclich, and she gave me the name of Grildrig. She made little clothes for me and gave me lessons every day in the language of her country. She was very kind to me, and I was only able to survive in that country because of her care and affection towards me. It now began to be known in the neighborhood that my master had found a strange animal in the field, smaller than a mouse, but exactly shaped like a human creature, which acted like a person, seemed to speak in a little language of its own, had already learned several words of their language, walked on 2 legs like a human being, was friendly and gentle, would come when it was called, and would do what it was asked to do. Another farmer who lived nearby and was a good friend of my master came to visit in order to find out if this story was true. I was immediately put upon the table, where I walked as I was commanded, pulled out my sword, put it away again, bowed to my master's guest, and asked him how he was doing, just as Glumdalclich had instructed me. My master's friend was a great miser, which was later proven by the terrible advice he gave my master, to show me as a sight on a market day in the next town. Glumdalclich, my little nurse, told me about it. She held me close and cried sadly, for she was afraid something bad would happen to me, and she thought it would be humiliating for me to be shown to the public for money. She said that her mother and father had promised I would be hers, but now they were treating her like they had the year before when they had given her a lamb. As soon as it was fat, they sold it to a butcher. My master, following the advice of his friend, took me in a box the next market day to the neighboring town, along with his daughter. The box had a little door in the side for me to go in and out, and a few holes in the top to let in air. We stopped at an inn, and I was placed upon a table in the largest room. My nurse stood on a stool near the table to take care of me and tell me what to do. My master allowed only 30 people at a time to see me. I walked around the table as the girl commanded. She asked me questions with words she knew I understood, and I answered in as loud a voice as possible. I turned around to the whole crowd, bowed to them, and made some speeches I had been taught. I took out my sword and moved it about in the air and drank some wine out of a small cup. That day I was shown to 12 different groups of people, always going through the same actions, till I was nearly dead from tiredness. Those who had seen me gave such wonderful reports about me to the rest of the people in the town that crowds were nearly breaking down the doors to come in. My master announced publicly that he would show me again the next market day. On the return home, I was so tired after entertaining the crowds for 8 hours straight that I could hardly stand or speak. But I didn't have any rest at home, for all the neighbors from 100 miles around, hearing about me, came to see me at my master's house. I was busy every day of the week, all day long. My master had discovered how much money he could make for me and decided to travel around with me to all the biggest cities of the country. Brobdingnag came with us, carrying me in a box tied around her waist. We spent 10 weeks traveling, and I was shown in 18 large towns. Finally, we reached the capital city. My master rented a room not far from the royal palace and sent out advertisements describing me and my tricks. I was shown 10 times a day, to the wonder of many people. In a few weeks, the tiring tricks I was forced to do every day made a large change in my health. The more money my master made for me, the greedier he became. I became very weak. The farmer observed it and, concluding I would soon die, decided to sell me to make as much money for me as he could. While he was thinking about this, a messenger came from the royal palace, commanding my master to take me there immediately to entertain the queen. She had heard reports about my wonderful appearance and the tricks I did. The great tricks I did. The queen was extremely delighted by me. She held out her little finger to me, which I held in both my arms. She asked me some general questions about my country and my travels, which I answered as clearly as I could. She asked me if I would like to live in the palace, and of course I said yes. She then asked my master if he was willing to sell me. He, who believed that I was so sick that I could not live another month, was willing to sell me and demanded 1,000 pieces of gold, which were immediately given to him. I begged the queen that Brobdingnag, who had always treated me with so much care and kindness, could be allowed to live in the palace too, to continue to be my nurse and teacher. The queen agreed, and the girl was very excited. The farmer left, saying goodbye to me. I didn't answer him, but only bowed coldly. The queen observed my coldness, and when the farmer was gone, asked me the reason. I told her that the only thing I could thank the man for was not killing me immediately when he had found me in the field, for he had made money by treating me like an animal, and I had become very ill by having to continually entertain crowds every hour of the day. But I told the queen that I no longer felt afraid of bad treatment now that I was under her protection. I was already beginning to feel much better now that I was with her. Chapter 6. At the Palace. A carpenter was commanded to build a wooden box that would be a bedroom for me. It had 2 windows, a door, and 2 closets, like a beautiful English bedroom. The board that made the ceiling could be lifted up and down, and a large bed was put in. The queen enjoyed being with me so much that she couldn't eat dinner without me. A little table was put for me next to the queen's plate, with a little chair to sit on. Brobdingnag sat near me to help me. I had a set of silver dishes and plates that were the same size as the dollhouse dishes you can see in a London toy shop. The queen always put a bit of meat on one of my dishes and loved to watch me eat. The king liked to talk with me, asking me about the manners, religion, politics, and education of Europe. I gave him the best descriptions I could, and he listened very carefully. He often picked me up in his right hand and laughed at the things I told him. He would say that it was very funny that even in such a tiny creature as I, there could be titles and distinctions of honor, and that the people of my country built little nests and holes that they called houses and cities. When he talked in this way, my face grew hot and red, for I was angry to hear my great country being laughed at. But even I laughed at myself when the queen held me in her hand and stood in front of a mirror, and I could see both of us together. There was nothing more ridiculous than the comparison of our sizes. The queen often criticized me for being cowardly, and she used to ask me whether the people of my country were all cowards like I was. The reason was this. There were a lot of flies in the kingdom in summer, and these disgusting insects, each of them as big as an English pigeon, bothered me during my dinner with their constant humming and buzzing around my ears. They sometimes landed on my food or on my nose or forehead. They smelled terrible, and I could easily see the disgusting sticky liquid which enabled them to walk on walls and ceilings. I had a lot of trouble defending myself against those terrible animals, and couldn't stop myself from jumping up with fear when they tried to land on my head. My solution was to cut them to pieces with my knife as they flew in the air, and my skills at this was admired by everyone. Besides the large box in which I was usually carried, the Queen ordered a smaller one to be made for me, about 12 feet square and 10 feet high, for traveling, because the other one was too large for Glumdalclitch's lap. This traveling box had a window in the middle of 3 of the walls, and each window had iron wire placed over it to prevent accidents in long journeys. On the 4th side, which had no window, there were 2 strong hooks, through which the person who carried me put a leather belt, which he put around his waist. I would have lived very happily in that country if my size had not exposed me to several ridiculous and frightening accidents. Glumdalclitch often carried me into the palace's garden in my smaller box, and sometimes took me out of it and held me in her hand, or put me down on the ground to walk around. One afternoon, Glumdalclitch put me down on some grass to walk by myself, and went to another part of the garden with her friends. While she was gone and out of hearing, a small white dog belonging to one of the gardeners began to run around near the place where I sat. The dog, following my smell, came right up to me, took me in his mouth, ran straight to his master, wagging his tail, and put me gently on the ground. Luckily, it had been so well taught that it carried me between its teeth without hurting me or even tearing my clothes. But the poor gardener, who knew me well, was very frightened. He gently took me up in both hands and asked me if I was okay, but I was so amazed and out of breath I could not speak. In a few minutes I recovered, and he carried me to my little nurse. She was very angry at the gardener because of his dog, but she and the gardener remained quiet about what had happened, because the girl was afraid that the Queen would be angry. I also thought it wouldn't be very good for me if everyone found out about what had happened to me. This accident made Glumdalclitch never want to let me out of her sight again. I had been afraid of this decision for a long time. I loved to have a bit of time to myself every day, so I didn't tell her about some other little unlucky adventures that happened in those times when I was left by myself. Once, a raven flying over the garden tried to grab me, and if I hadn't pulled out my sword and run under a large flower, it would have certainly carried me away in its claws. Another time, walking to the top of a fresh molehill, I fell up to my neck in the hole, and had to lie later in order to explain why my clothes were dirty. And once I hurt my right leg against the shell of a snail, which I happened to fall over as I was walking alone and thinking about England, which I so painfully missed. Chapter 7. Return to England. Throughout my stay in Brobdingnag, as the country was called, I hoped I would some day become free again, though it was impossible to imagine how this could happen. The ship in which I sailed was the first one ever to come close to their coast, and the king had given strict orders that if another ever appeared, it should be brought on shore and carried to him with all its crew and passengers. He wanted to find me a woman of my own size, so we could have children, but I think I would rather have died than have my descendants kept in cages and perhaps sold as curiosities in the kingdom. I was treated with great kindness, and the king and queen loved me, but I was living in a way that was very humiliating. I wished to be among people with whom I could talk equally, and walk about the streets and fields without fear of being stepped on and killed like a frog or a young puppy. But my freedom came sooner than I expected, and in a very unusual way. I had now been in this country for 2 years. At about the beginning of the 3rd year, Glumdalclitch and I went with the king and queen and the royal family on a trip to the south coast of the kingdom. I was carried, as usual, in my traveling box. I wished to see the ocean, which could be the only way for me to escape, if it would ever be possible, but Glumdalclitch was very ill and had to stay in bed. I pretended to be a bit ill too, and said that I needed the fresh air of the sea and asked permission for a young servant to take me there. I will never forget with what unwillingness Glumdalclitch finally agreed to this, nor the strict orders she gave to the boy to be careful with me. She began to cry at the same time, as if she somehow knew what was going to happen to me. The boy took me out in my box about half an hour's walk from the palace, towards the rocks on the seashore. I asked him to set me down and told him I wanted to take a nap, so he shut the windows of my box to keep out the cold sea wind. I'm not sure what happened next, but all I can suppose is that the servant, thinking nothing bad could possibly happen to me, went among the rocks to look for birds' eggs. I was suddenly awoken by a violent pull upon the ring which was attached to the top of my box to make it easier to carry. I felt my box lifted high in the air and then carried forward with great speed. I shouted several times as loud as I could. I looked out my windows, but could see nothing but clouds and sky. I heard a noise just over my head, like the flapping of wings, and then realized that an eagle had grabbed the ring of my box in its beak, planning to let it fall on the rocks to break it open, like a tortoise in a shell, and then pull out my body and eat it. After a while, the noise and flapping of wings increased, and my box was tossed up and down. I heard several bangs, and then, all of a sudden, felt myself falling straight down for over a minute. My fall was stopped by a terrible crash, after which everything was dark for another minute. Then my box began to rise higher, and I could see some light through my windows. I realized that I had fallen into the sea. I suppose that the eagle which had flown away with my box was chased by 2 or 3 other eagles, and was forced to let me drop while it was defending itself against the rest, who all wanted to eat me. My box was so strongly built that it didn't break when it hit the surface of the water. During this time, I often thought of my dear Glumdalclitch and wished to be with her. I felt sorry for her, for surely she would be very sad to find me gone, and the king and queen would be angry with her. Surely no other travelers had been under as much stress as I experienced at this time, expecting every moment that my box would be smashed to pieces. Even if my box survived and did not fill up with water, what could I expect but a miserable death from cold and hunger? For 4 hours I was in this situation, expecting every moment to be my last. While I was in this miserable state, I heard a noise on the side of my box where the rings for the belt were, and soon it began to feel like the box was being pulled along the sea. This gave me some small feeling of hope, though I was not able to imagine how this could be happening. I called for help in a loud voice in all the languages I knew. I tied my handkerchief to my walking stick and put it out the hole at the top of my box, waving it several times in the air, so that if any boat or ship were near, the sailors might realize that someone was shut up in the box. I eventually felt the box being lifted up into the air slowly. I shouted again. A great shout answered mine, filling me with joy. Then I heard someone calling through the hole loudly in English. I answered, begging for help. The voice replied that I was safe, and that a carpenter would immediately come and cut a hole in the top of the box large enough to pull me out. I answered that it was unnecessary, and all that had to be done was for one of the crew to put his finger in the ring and take the box out of the sea and into the ship. Some of them, when hearing me talk so wildly, thought I was crazy, and others laughed, for I hadn't realized yet that I was now among people of my own size and strength. The carpenter came, and in a few minutes cut a hole about 4 feet square, then let down a ladder, which I climbed up, and from there I was taken into the ship in a very weak condition. The sailors were all amazed and asked me 1,000 questions, but the captain, an honest, friendly Englishman, observed that I was very weak, and took me into his cabin, gave me some food, and allowed me to rest in his own bed. I slept for many hours, but was constantly disturbed by the dreams of the place I had left and the dangers I had escaped. However, upon waking I felt better. I ate with the captain, and he explained that he had observed my box floating in the sea through his telescope. Seeing what looked like a floating house, he ordered some men to go out to it in a boat and to pull it to the ship with some long cables. I told the captain all about Brobdingnag and the adventures I had had there, but he thought my brain was disturbed and told me I should rest for the remaining part of the journey to England. I was overjoyed when I finally saw my country and family again.